Hello, friends. Welcome back to ABN's Trinity channel for another episode of Colliding Worldviews. It's such a blessing for you to be here with us right now, as this is broadcast throughout the world through high-speed internet, but also on many digital platforms. If you have an Apple or Android device, Apple TV, Roku, Amazon Fire Stick TV, and a whole lot of other platforms, you can actually watch this show and all the weekly shows live, but you can also pick up the reruns on ABN's digital tree. You can also find them on the Trinity channel's YouTube channel and also on my Vimeo channel, vimeo.com/Tony Gourlay. It's a blessing to have you here every single week. And actually today is the start of a 7-week series to end this year of a great year of Colliding Worldviews. Today is day one of, again, 7 weeks between today and December 18th. Every single Monday, which is your regular Colliding Worldviews time, we are doing a 7-week series with Dr. J. Smith. And he is here with us right now. It's a blessing to have him back once again. He was just joining us in the second International Apologetics Marathon of 2017. Dr. Smith, it's great to have you back once again.
Tony, thank you for having me.
It's our blessing to have you here, and I know our viewers are really excited. You've been letting people know about it. We've been letting people know about it. So we know a lot of people are tuned in, and they will be tuned in for the next 6 weeks, we hope, because we are just starting this series today. I want to give our audience the topics that we're going to be covering. Today, we are doing why are there 2 compilations of the Quran? November 13th, what has happened to the 9 earliest Quranic manuscripts? November 20th, why are there 4 Islamic Qiblas? November 27th, what is the Andalusian problem? December 4th, why haven't we been told about the 2 periods of slave trade? December 11th, why are there 31 different Arabic Qurans today? And December 18th, to end it off, doesn't Islam have many historical problems? All these questions is what we are going to be answering today and the next 7 weeks. So it's a blessing to have you here. If you have friends who are Christians who want to reach out to Muslims, let them know about this series. Get the videos, YouTube channel, my Vimeo channel, and Dr. Smith is going to add them to his channels as well. So there's no excuse not to watch them, no excuse not to share them, but people need this information. Not only Christians who have a heart to reach Muslims with the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, but of course 1.6 billion Muslims in the world need this information as well, because they don't know this stuff. And it's such a blessing to have Dr. Smith here, who recently received his PhD in Islamic studies and of course, has been debating Muslims for many years, Speaker's Corner. And today, and again, the next 6 weeks, he will be here. Dr. Smith, what would you like to tell our audience just to start off this series and this particular topic that we're starting off with today?
Thanks, Tony. Yeah. What we're going to be doing is starting with this book right here. We're going to be unpacking some of the real historical problems concerning how this book was put together. And today's topic is just that. How did they compile the Quran? What were some of the questions that we need to ask concerning what Islam has been telling us? What they've been telling us for 1,400 years, we now know is not for 14, it's more like 1,200 years. We're going to be unpacking some of what they claim, looking at how these are not historically viable, and asking questions about the man behind the book and also the book itself. So you want to get right into it, we can do that now, because I think we only have 1 hour, and it'd be great to unpack the compilation of the Quran. How did it begin? What do we know?
And we have a whole lot of information that we're going to be sharing. I want to let our viewers know out there that, like the marathon shows and like our other weekly shows, you can call in. We do want to take callers during this 7-week series. But the thing is that when you call in and talk to one of our technicians, give them your name and then give them your question. We want to do that so that we don't get any rabbit trails, get taken off topic. But if you have any questions at all about the topic that we're talking about, then feel free to call in. The number's on the bottom of your screen. You can ask these questions to Dr. Smith, and he will answer them as best as he is able. But we're so thankful just to have you here. Dr. Smith, let's go ahead and go right into it.
Well, let's go ahead and let's ask the question. Here's what Muslims claim, and this is what I've been hearing for 35 years of working with Islam. First and foremost, they claim that this book, this Qur'an that I have in my hand today, is eternal. It has never been, it was never created. It exists on some eternal tablets that exist in heaven, and we get that from the Quran itself. In chapter 85, Surah 85, verse 22. It's very clear that this is derived from eternal time. So that's the first thing. It's eternal. Secondly, it was sent down over a period of 22 to 23 years between 610 and 632 to a man named Muhammad. For the first 12 years in Mecca, the next 10 years in Medina. That's their claim. Not our claim. That's their claims. That's claim number two. Number three, that though it was sent down during that period, it was not finished at that period. It was not compiled during his lifetime. It was first compiled immediately after his lifetime. So between 632 and 634. That's the first compilation, what they call the first recension. And then a second compilation, a second recension, was compiled during the time of Uthman, the third caliph, around 652, but roughly 20 years after Muhammad's death. And then fourthly, the fourth claim is that this book that we have in our hands today is exactly the same as that which is in heaven, the eternal Qur'an, that which was sent down to Muhammad over that 22 to 23 year period, and that which was both compiled in 632 and in 652. The two different compilations. Now, we're not going to go through and unpack all of number 2 and 3. What we're going to do today is just look at those first two compilations. We're going to question what and the reason and why was this not written down. We're going to ask why it was not written down during Muhammad's time. But mostly, what was that first recension and what is the second recension? Now, to do that, what I want to do, Tony, is I want to even ask some questions. So let's go right into the questions concerning this compilation, this Quran, how it was put together. We're not going to talk about eternality. Listen, there's no way we can confront that or dispute it or prove it or in any way, shape, or form. It would waste our time. We're not going to even talk about whether it was sent down because, again, that's something that happened 1,400 years. If it did happen 1,400 years ago, we cannot disprove or prove it. We're just going to really talk about the last two suppositions, that it was compiled completely, first during the time of Abu Bakr, and secondly during the time of Uthman. That's what we're going to do, and that's what we're going to really confront today. That's the session for today. But I want to ask some questions even before we get to that compilation. Is that okay, Tony, if I ask some questions?
Yeah.
Here we go. First and foremost, if God in his wisdom wanted to compile yet another revelation, we already have the Bible. We have both the Old and the New Testament in this book right here. And that has been compiled. We know that it was compiled in Hebrew for the Old Testament, and it was compiled in Greek for the New Testament. No one really disputes that today. And therefore, it was then closed. We see that in the book of Revelation. That revelation is closed after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And of course, the New Testament is written down. So by the first century, there is no longer any need for any new revelation. Now, Muslims tell us that there was a need for yet a further revelation. That was the revelation that was given to the final, the greatest, the seal of all prophets. Now, let me ask some questions about that, Tony, real quickly. If this is the seal, the greatest of all prophets, I've got 4 problems right off the top. First, this prophet's not in the prophetic line. Why would God choose someone who's not in the prophetic line, since every one of the prophets I see in this book, the ones who the Bible is revealed to, all the prophetic line comes from the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we know that line is sacrosanct because of Genesis chapter 17, where God basically answered the question that Abraham had about Ishmael, that he would bless Ishmael, he would have 12 sons, but his covenant would come through Isaac. So every prophet that's in this book that is part of that prophetic line, including Jesus Christ. Secondly, every prophet in this book did something to prove he was a prophet. Either they did miracles or they did a prophecy. What miracle did Muhammad do? He didn't. 3 times Muslims had to ask, the Jews in Medina asked him to do miracles. All 3 times, all Muhammad would say is, the prophets before did miracles, you killed them, I'm nothing more than a messenger. Not much of a defense. It would have been great if he could have just done one simple miracle, because that's the function of the prophet, to prove their authority, or have done a prophecy to prove their authority. He did neither. So that's the second problem. Thirdly, when I look at these 2 books and I compare them side by side, there is contradiction after contradiction between these 2 books. You can see right, left, and center, even the stories of the major characters. The biblical characters between these two books, the stories of Abraham, the story of Moses, the story, goodness sakes, the stories of Cain and Abel. So many of the stories just don't agree, and especially when we get to Jesus Christ. When you look at this book and you look at this book and you look and see what this book does with Jesus Christ, so many contradictions. Why would God give a revelation to a prophet, the greatest prophet, that completely contradicted everything he had done already in this book? And then fourthly, and this is probably the most difficult one for Muslims to answer, if Muhammad really is the prophet of God, then why in the world did he not know God's holy name? Every prophet knew that they came in the name of Yahweh. Yahweh was the name that Moses needed before he went down to Egypt, before he went down to bring the Israelites back. He turned to God in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14 and 15, and asked God, what is your name? So when I go down there to bring the Israelites up, they will know what God I represent. And God gave the name at that time, and it was Yahweh. I am in English, or ego eimi, ha-on in Greek. That's the name we want to look for, and that's the name we find all through this book. 6,823 times. You will find that name used by every prophet. Jesus used that name. He even claimed it for himself in John chapter 8, verse 58. And the Jews picked up stones to stone him, because here, supposedly, a mere man was not only using the name, his holy name, the personal name of God, but he was claiming it for himself, claiming the divine title. Now, if that is the case, how could then God choose yet another prophet 600 years later who didn't even know his name? So he's not in the prophetic line. He didn't do anything to prove he was a prophet. His revelation contradicted what had come before. God does not contradict himself, and he didn't even know what God he represented. Those are the first four problems I have right off the bat. Let's go on and let's do some other problems. And these are the ones that we have on the handout that we've sent out to everybody. Why didn't God use a language which could have accommodated his word? When you take a look at the Quran and you look at the Arabic that's here, the Arabic that's here, when you look at it, you will see it's easy to read today. In the 21st century, we can read all of it because it has diacritical marks. That means the dots above and below the lines. It has vowelization, the dhamma, the kasra, the fatha. All these are incorporated into the text. But that is not how the earliest manuscripts are found. When you look, and we'll get into that in the next week. Next week, we're going to look at the earliest 6 manuscripts, and we're going to ask the question concerning those Arabic words, because they don't have diacritical marks. They don't have vowelization. If God in his wisdom were to send yet another revelation, which I doubt right off the top of my head, why in the world did he send in a language that couldn't even accommodated his revelation, when he already had Hebrew, he already had Greek? That's already was well intended. In fact, Greek and Hebrew could well accommodate his revelation, had already done so for 1,400 years. So that's the first question. Secondly, coming back to Muhammad, why didn't God choose a man who could read or write? Listen, that was his function. That was what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to give a revelation, the greatest revelations, Muslims tell us, the final revelation, that seal of all revelations. Then why in the world did God give the book? This is a revelation. This is a book. This is something that you read. Why didn't he give it to someone who could read and write? And secondly, if he could not read or write, this is what Muslims tell us, he had 22 years to do so. What happened in those intervening 22 years? If this was the sole, really the only responsibility he had, if this is what he's best known for, if this is what reason why we have a final revelation, if this is the revelation he gave, then why could he not even read and write his own revelation? He had 22 years. It doesn't take that long to read and write Arabic. I've had 2 years of Arabic. I could read and write it within the first week. That's why I'm asking these questions. Go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, one thing that I want to let our viewers know about as well, as you are asking them to ask themselves these questions, whether they're Muslims, Christians, or whoever else, when they're wondering these things, something that they also need to know is that when we look at the Quran and we compare it to Jewish history, we compare it to the New Testament, it's completely revisionist history that Islam has come up with, or Muslims in particular, because it's this Abrahamic fallacy that even Dr. Mark Dury talks about. And many times, they say, yeah, we love Jesus, we love Abraham, we looked at all these people, but their understanding of who those people are don't line up with actual history. Every single worldview outside of Islam does not agree with Islam in any way. Whereas Christianity is a fulfillment of of Judaism, or at least the Judaism of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the same Abraham there that Christians are looking back to, and that Jews were talking about the Messiah to come. This is not the case with Islam. It's a completely different Abraham. And many viewers out there don't know that the Islamic view is that Abraham was a Muslim, Jesus was a Muslim, Moses was a Muslim, Adam was a Muslim. So we always need to ask people, what do you mean by that? Or who is this person to you? And this is just more background information that people need to keep in mind, not only today, but in the next 6 weeks as we use these terms, and that the fact that Muslims define them completely differently.
Now, let me give in case in point. Let me just carry on from what you just said. And it's great you brought this up. This idea of continuity. When you take a look at the story of Abraham in Surah 21, you will see that he is in Mecca, of all places. I had no idea that Abraham was in Mecca. He goes into the Kaaba, and in the middle of the night, he destroys all these idols, comes out the next morning. The people see the destroyed idols. They go to Abraham and say, what have you done? He said, well, talk to the largest idol. I have nothing to do with it. They don't believe him, and they throw him into a fiery pit. Now, that is not in my Bible, so even the stories don't make sense. In fact, as I recall in my Bible, it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that were thrown into a fiery pit, not Abraham. And what is he doing 600 miles too far south? He was not down in anywhere near Mecca or Medina or in the Hijaz. He was not even in Arabia. They've got the wrong man at the wrong place doing the wrong thing, which suggests to me that this comes from another source. We're going to get into that in another week. We're going to talk about source criticism. That particular story comes from the second Targum of Esther. It's a 2nd century apocryphal account written as nothing more than folk tales by the Jews, never considered to be authoritative, and yet it finds its way into the Quran. So that's in chapter 21. That's just the case in point. There's such discontinuity between the revelations that we have to ask these questions. Now let's go back and let's continue this list of questions. And we've already said it doesn't make sense to come up with yet another revelation that contradicts the previous revelations. My God does not contradict himself. When you look at the Old and the New Testament, there is no contradiction there. When you look at from Genesis to Revelation, you will see a flow of history all the way through, right through 1,400 years. That's why I love my Bible. It all fits to a piece. Once we get to the Quran, suddenly there's a disjoint. Now, when we get and we look at this, we ask the question, if God is going to choose a revelation, for heaven's sakes, use one language that we already know, or they could have accommodated it, that was sophisticated enough. Arabic was not sophisticated. It was very crude. It did not have even the vowelization. It did not even have the diacritical markings so that we can distinguish one word from another. You take one letter like this, just a little bowl shape, and you put a dot above it, it becomes a nut. 2 dots above it becomes a ta. 3 dots above it becomes a tha. 1 dot below it becomes a ba. 2 dots below it becomes a ya. Na, ta, tha, ba, ya. It could be 5 different letters today, but those were all introduced in the 8th century, long after Muhammad had been dead. He'd been dead for almost 100 years before those were introduced. So can you see where in God's wisdom, not my God, not the God of the Bible, would he even want to introduce a book to a people that did not yet have a language that was sophisticated enough? Why would he choose a man that could not read or write? And why didn't that man learn to read or write? But here's the second thing. That man, Muhammad, did, according to the traditions, he did have a secretary. His name was Zayd ibn Thabit. If that were the case, why did Zayd ibn Thabit not write it down during that intervening 22 to 23 year period? Now, Muslims are going to have a hard time trying to answer these questions. They will tell you, well, he did write parts of it down. There's another one, Ubay ibn Ka'b, who wrote it down. Another one named Ibn Masud, who wrote it down. Another one named Ibn Musa, who wrote it down. So you have 4 different writers of 4 different Qurans. One became popular in Damascus, one became popular in Basra, one became popular in Baghdad, and then Zayd ibn Thabit became popular in Medina. That's what the traditions tell us. Already, we're going to see this, that the traditions are already confused concerning where this Quran was coming from. And I would like to ask and continue to ask these questions. All right, Zayd ibn Thabit was the secretary of Muhammad. What do secretaries do? Do they not write? Is that not their job?
That's all they're supposed to do.
I would guess so. If Muhammad couldn't read or write, give the job to Zayd ibn Thabit, which is ironic.
He needs to be writing. He needs to be writing even more. If Muhammad can't write himself, I mean, Muhammad can't even look at it and say, "Hey, you misspelled this," or "Hey, I didn't say that." It's like they need to be writing even more than if he could read or write himself. But another problem. And why would God choose a language that didn't even exist, at least written wise? I mean, Arabic as a spoken language existed at that time, but as a written language, it did not. I mean, how many other languages were already completely formed that it would have been much smarter for this all-wise God to fix what had been corrupted supposedly by the Jews and the Christians? But, I mean, these are all good questions that need to be asked to people who claim that the Bible is inaccurate.
Now, we need to make sure that Muslims answer these questions. And that's why those of you who are watching, and I hope some Muslims are watching, and those Christians who are watching, and I hope you are, take these questions on board. Start with these are just initial questions. That's why we're introducing them on the first show. Initially, we need to even ask, as Christians and Jews, those of us who already have a revelation, we know that the Jewish revelation, the Old Testament, is foundational to everything we believe. We do not throw the Old Testament out. We need the Old Testament. We need it not only to know what God was doing back in 1400 BC and all the way up until the time the Messiah came. We also need to know who God is, what he's like. We need to know how he interacts with his people. We need to know about all these prophecies, over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament that point to the fact that there is a Messiah, the Prince of Peace, who's going to come, who is going to die, yes, and he's going to be between two robbers. We even know how he's going to die, and we even know why he's going to die, because he's going to take on our sins. This is all in the Old Testament. We need all this to even know who this Jesus Christ is, who the Emmanuel is, God with us when he does arrive. Therefore, it's foundational to have the Old Testament. We're not saying that we don't need the Old Testament. Please don't get us wrong. But once we do get Jesus, when God does enter time and space and then finally enters and does his mission, which is to die and rise again, once that happens, then you see everything has been fulfilled that was promised. Those 330 prophecies are all fulfilled in one man. Once that's fulfilled, there is no longer any need for any other revelation. That's why I've been asking Muslims for 35 years, why suddenly another revelation? And if it is another revelation, why in a language that could not even accommodate it? Remember, Arabic comes from the Nabatean language, the Nabatean script. The Nabateans did have a script, but the Arabs did not have that script. And that's why when we derive many of our words, in fact, the name like Allah is a Nabatean God. These are words, these are phrases that have come out of the Nabateans. But the Nabateans were not even in Mecca. They were 600 miles further north. They were way up in Petra. We're going to talk about that in a few weeks. It all will come together in about 3 or 4 weeks. But nonetheless, let's just stick with this problem here. We're going to have a break in a few minutes, but after we come back from the break, Tony, what I want to do is then go to the actual reference point of how this book was compiled. We're going to go to Al-Bukhari. We're going to go to Volume 6. We're going to go to 2 hadith. These are the only 2 hadith that show us the picture. This is what the Muslims are claiming, because this is what their traditions tell us how the Quran was compiled. And Tony, when we come back from the break, it's going to be fun, because what I want to do, now we've opened up the real can of words. Now we're going to actually look at their texts. We're going to look at their traditions, and then we're going to ask them some disturbing questions concerning what Al-Bukhari said. Okay, let's do that, and we'll come back. But I'll give it over to you, Tony, for now.
We have some sources that we will be showing on our screen, so make sure that, again, you're getting these videos and sharing them with other people, because if you haven't seen hadith sources, which again is something that Muslims look to, a Sunni Muslim, and Sunnis are about 90% of the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. They're Sunnis because they follow the Sunnah, or they claim to, and they're following the Quran, which is again supposedly an eternal book that came from tablets through Gabriel, the angel, and it was given to Muhammad. But then also the hadith that Dr. Smith just mentioned, those are the sayings of Muhammad, things that Muhammad said and did and approved and disapproved of. And then, of course, we also have the Sirah literature, which are the biographies of Muhammad. The Sirah and the Hadith, that is the Sunnah. That's the example of Muhammad himself, which, again, the Islamic claim is that he is the perfect man of all time, the perfect Muslim of all time, which is a very dangerous claim to make, especially if you haven't looked at the sources and see what they say. But these Hadith that we're going to be showing you when we come back from the break and talking about, this is what Muslims are supposed to be looking to. But that's something to keep in mind, though, too, is that Islam, for the most part, is really about orthopraxy more than orthodoxy. There are a ton of Muslims throughout the world who pray 5 times a day. They fast during the month of Ramadan. They try to make a trip to Mecca for the Hajj. They give money to charity. They say the Shahada to become a Muslim, all that stuff. But it's more about practice and trying to do enough good deeds to make up for your bad and that kind of thing. It's more about just how you live your life than actually what you believe. So sometimes, as you'll hear in this series, Christians are looking to the sources more than many Muslims do themselves. So we want to get you knowledgeable about this stuff so that you can have it in the back of your mind when you go and reach out to Muslims. And again, we as Christians are the only hope that Muslims have. If we don't share the gospel with Muslims, well, who is going to? No one's going to. So we hope that this 7-week series better equips you and builds your confidence to reach out to Muslims. And we're going to take a short break. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes with more Colliding Worldviews.
Starting November 6th and lasting each Monday until December 18th, Colliding Worldviews will have a special 7-week series with Dr. J. Smith, hosted by Tony Gurule. Several topics will be covered in this historical critique series. Such topics include the 2 compilations of the Qur'an, the 6 earliest Quranic manuscripts, the 4 Qiblas, the Andalusian problem with Dr. Daniel Gnostic, the 2 slave trades, the 31 Arabic Qurans, and the historical problems with Islam. Tune in to the Trinity channel every Monday at 4:30 p.m. Eastern and 1:30 p.m. Pacific time from November 6th through December 18th for the special end of the year series.
Now in the palm of your hand is the updated ABN SAD app, so you can now watch all of the programs, shows, and channels in different languages. You can download the app in the App Store related to your device. Once downloaded, you will see 6 different categories within the ABN SAT app. The first category being the English category, which includes 18 different channels. The Arabic category includes 31 channels. The Worship category has 5 channels. The Discipleship category includes 5 channels as well. For more information, please call the numbers on your screen or visit our website at trinitychannel.com.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to ABN's Trinity channel for another episode of Colliding Worldviews. Again, today is day 1 of a 7-week series with Dr. J. Smith, the historical critique series, as we talk about the Quran and a bunch of other topics. Again, 6 other topics to look forward to. And how great will it be after this 7-week series for all of us to celebrate the birth of the Lord Jesus Christ on December 25th? And we want to encourage you Christians out there, give you a lot of tips and tools, and build your confidence to reach out to Muslims around you. Now, a lot of people love our international apologetics marathons. Apologetics is when we defend our faith. This 7-week series is more about polemics and critiquing another faith. And that's what we're going to be doing, is doing polemics and critiquing the Islamic worldview, the Quran, which is supposedly the eternal word of Allah, and then, of course, Muhammad himself, and even the Hadith. And that's what we're going to now. Dr. Smith, again, it's great to have you here. And we have some pictures of Sahih al-Bukhari, which is the most highly esteemed Hadith collection amongst Sunni Muslims. Again, about 90% of the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world.
Yeah, while they're putting up there, while you're putting it up on the screen, let me give some background to what we're looking at. The Quran doesn't say how it was put together. It's very piecemeal. Very much, a lot of the Quran is difficult to read for those who have even tried in English, let alone in Arabic. But what we do know is that in order to know how it was compiled, since that's the subject for today's talk, we need to go back to the sayings of the Prophet, the hadith. Now remember, these did not exist. These hadith did not exist during Muhammad's lifetime. They didn't even exist during the century that Muhammad lived. The hadith were first compiled by al-Bukhari. He is the first to actually create a compilation of what we know as hadith. You're correct. There were other compilations of his biography written by Ibn Hisham, Ibn Ishaq, and al-Waqidi. Those come, well, Ibn Ishaq is 765. We don't have any of his material. We're dependent on Ibn Hisham, who takes what he likes and throws away what he doesn't, and he died in 833. So that's 200 years after Muhammad died. We get the first material on Muhammad's life. That's rather odd. We're going to talk more about that in other segments. And then we get al-Waqidi, who writes about 5 years after Ibn Hisham. When the hadith start getting to compile as a genre, that was first done by al-Bukhari, and he dies in 870. So we're talking about 240 years after Muhammad's death. We finally get someone writing down his sayings, which means Bukhari never knew Muhammad. He was living 200 years after Muhammad. So he was not there in the century Muhammad lived, nor did he ever even live where Muhammad lived. He lived in Bukhara, which is up in north of Iran today. What's interesting, this is the story that goes. He was given 600,000 of these sayings, these akhbars, and he whittled them down all the way down to around 7,400, 7,397 to be exact. So he threw out 98% of it and only kept 2%. So all we have is that 2% to look at. And it's in that 2%, there are 9 volumes in that 2%. In the 6th volume, hadith number 509 and 510 is the most comprehensive reference point on how the Quran was put together. And that's what we're going to look at today. So this is the best we've got. We have nothing better. And that's the problem. And Muslims have not resolved that. Nonetheless, since it's the best we've got, let's take a look at it. So let's put it up there on the screen, and let's look at starting with chapter 6, hadith number 509. There you can see. And we see it there. We're not going to read the whole thing down. It'll take too long. Just look at the red underlined parts. Now notice we have the Arabic and the English. We're putting them side by side. This is the translation of the Arabic written by Ibn Hisham in the late 9th century. And he says, narrated by Zayd ibn Thabit. So this is the secretary of Muhammad that we were just talking about before the break. He is the one that's narrating this. And he says that Abu Bakr sent for him. That means Zayd ibn Thabit. And because many of those who had memorized the Quran had died at the Battle of Yamama in 632 and 633. So he was sent by Abu Bakr and also by Umar. The one caliph follows the other. The two of them were concerned because so many people had died at the Battle of Yamama. And they said, because of these casualties, that's the second red line you see there, those who had memorized the Quran, coming down to the third line there, a large part of the Quran may be lost, they said. And then just below that, it says the Quran, they needed to collect the Quran. Now, Umar says, how can we do something which Allah's apostle did not do? So there we see, right under the third line, there is his question, how can we do something that Muhammad himself didn't even do, proving that Muhammad had not collected the Quran. When Muslims say, oh yeah, it was all collected before Muhammad died. No, this is very clear that Muhammad had not collected the Quran. Now, let's continue down to the next red line. Let's move the sheet up a bit. And when we get down to the next red line, if you could move the sheet up a bit, whoever's in charge of the sheet, can you move that up, Tony, if you could do that?
I'm not in control of that, but we can do it right now. There we go.
Now, that next line, can you see it says, you should search for fragmentary scripts of the Quran and collect it in one book. So here, Abu Bakr and Umar are telling Zayd ibn Thabit to do this. You, Zayd ibn Thabit, you're the secretary. You're the one in charge of this. You go and find all the fragmentary copies. Now, what does he mean there? Well, some of this is written on bones, some of this is written on stone, some of this is written on bark, and others come from the memory of the companions of the Prophet. So he's given the task to do all this. So, and coming down to the next bunch of red lines, so I started looking for the Quran and collecting it from what was written on palms, leaves, stalks, thin white stones, and also for the men who knew it by heart. He goes in that task. Now, here's the question I have. Why is it so fragmentary? And if this is the case, who is Zayd ibn Thabit? Muhammad's no longer long. He is dead. He's been dead for 2 years now. He's not there to suggest or even say this is correct or that's not correct. In fact, if you come down now to that last red line that you say, I did not find it with anybody else. He's looking for one piece, and he didn't find that bit with anybody else. So you can see he's finding bits and pieces here, and it's all coming down to Zayd ibn Thabit. So if you want to give credit for this first copy of the Quran, I don't think we should be giving credit to Muhammad for this first copy. He was not even around. This first copy of the Quran looks like is nothing more than a creation by a secretary of Muhammad. I'm not hearing Muslims question this.
And we're not even to the burn what you don't like part of the story. I mean, we're at the point where we're just, let's try to find what he said supposedly.
This is the first copy that's ever been written down, and it's written by a secretary. He does not have any prophetic office. He has no injunction from God. He again is nothing more than somebody who is doing what Muhammad should have done before he died. Can you see? This is kind of an afterthought. Now, either this is incompetence, or this is not how God works. And I can't believe that God would let something this important, if this is the greatest, the final, the seal of all revelation, why in God's wisdom did he give it to a man who didn't know how to read or write, a man who was who's not in the prophetic line, and a man who forgot to write it down during his lifetime? Now, finally, it's two caliphs who come afterwards who say, wait a minute. A lot of these people who are dying, they're dying with the Quran in their heads. This is after they've already died. How do we know a lot of them didn't take the Quran with them?
And according to the Islamic worldview, this is the process of fixing what Jews supposedly corrupted and what Christians supposedly corrupted. This is the let's get back to where we're supposed to be process, which doesn't sound good at all, right?
Doesn't sound good at all. And we're only talking about the first compilation, the first recension. Now we're going to move over to the second recension. Now let's go to chapter 6, hadith number 510. In some ways, 509 is the first recension, 510 is the second recension. That means the second copy. What we do know is that this first copy was given to the daughter of Umar. Her name was Hafsa. She was also one of the wives of Muhammad. He had 12 wives. This was just one of his 12 wives. This copy that Zayd ibn Thabit finally put together by finding from stones and leather and bark and the memory of those who hadn't died at Yamama, he then gives this copy to Hafsa, and she sticks it under her bed. Now we're about roughly 20 years later. Now we're in 652. Abu Bakr has died. Umar has been killed. Uthman now is the third caliph. Uthman comes to power in 646, and now around 650 to 652. So he's been in power for about 4 to 6 years. And he is there, and he is concerned because Hudayfa bin Hudayfa, and I want to get the right name, Hudayfa al-Yamam comes to him. And he's upset because he says there are differences in the recitation of the Quran. Can you see that there in red? So he says to Uthman, O chief of the believers, save this nation before they differ about the book. That means the Quran, as the Jews and the Christians did before. So there's already a revelation that there's differences in what the Jews and Christians had done before. They don't want the same thing to happen to the Quran. So what does Uthman do? Well, he sends for Hafsa, that's the wife, sends for her copy that she has under her bed, sends for the manuscript of the Quran so that we may compile the Quran materials in perfect copies and return the manuscript. So give us your copy, he says, so that we can compile it in other copies and then give back your original copy. Now, why does he need to do this? Well, Tony, can you see the reason why he has to do this?
Yeah, it's not looking good for the Islamic worldview, it seems.
Now, this is what Muslims will say. They will say, the reason for this is because there were different recitations. This is called ahruf or kiryat. Ahruf or kiryat, you will ask 5 different Muslims, they'll give you 5 different definitions for ahruf or kiryat. But most of them would say it has to do with how you pronounce the word. Now, when you, if you go buy a newspaper today that's in Cairo, written in Arabic. In a newspaper stand, you will see it has the consonantal text, but it does not have, many times it doesn't have the diacritical marks, and it doesn't have the dama, the kasra, and the fatha, the vowelization. The reason for that is because those who are those who are publishing these newspapers in Cairo want to make sure that these newspapers are read in Tunis, that they're read in as far as way as Jordan. They want to be read all over the Arab world. They want to make sure that as many Arab speakers will read their newspapers, but every time an Arab speaker looks at the consonantal text, they put their own dialogical differences. These are they pronounce it different ways, and that's why all over the Arab world you have different pronunciations. This is what supposedly was the problem with this text, and I'm hearing Muslims tell me that's why you needed a final text, because of the different pronunciations. There were 7 supposedly of these ahruf adding existence. Well, here's the problem. Okay, so that well enough. The difficulty is, how can you have dialogical differences without diacritical marks, without vowelization? As we said before the break, there was no vowelization in the 7th century. There are no diacritical marks on any of the earliest manuscripts. When we look at them next week, you will see none of the manuscripts have any of these dialogical differences. It's just the consonantal text. That's all they were. So why in the world would you want to write a new one if you've already got the original one? If you've already got the consonantal text in place, as we've been told, ahruf and kidat make no sense. Now that's for Arabic speakers. Go ahead, Tony.
So staying with this frame of thought, I mean, if this is the actual story, they would have to conclude, or they would have to basically admit or claim, I guess, that Muslims were pronouncing the consonantal text differently.
Absolutely. Who cares how you pronounce it? It's still written the same way. The razm doesn't change. So whether you're a Tunisian or an Algerian or an Egyptian or an Arab from Jordan or from Syria, you still read the same razm, the same consonantal text. You read in reading it, put in your own pronunciation. So why am I asking? I'm asking that, why in the world would you need to have a whole new recension if this was the problem? Obviously, this is, look and see the date that this is written down. We've said this is the late 9th century. This is Al-Bukhari who's writing this. In the late 9th century, there would have been dialogical differences. So this is pretty much showing that whoever wrote Al-Bukhari, if it was Al-Bukhari, whoever's writing this down is not aware of the fact of their own history of the Arabic text. They're not even aware of how the Arabic text evolved. I'm going to leave that for Muslims to decide. I'm not going to sit here and spend any more time on this. Just to bring it up, it's a problem for Arabic-speaking Muslims. Let's move on now, and let's go back to that sheet, and let's bring up what we see next. So what he says is, write it in the Qurayshi dialect. In case you disagree, write it. If we could bring it down to the next red lines. Okay, right there. Write it manuscripts in perfect copies. In case you disagree, hold on a minute. How can you disagree? It's in front of you. It's written. The text is from Hafsa. What's there to disagree? There is no vowelization. There are no diacritical marks in the 7th century. So how can they disagree? They just write it as is, like the monks used to do when they took the biblical text. They would take every letter and write it exactly the same way. If you want to make copies, then the humans become the Xerox copies of that day, you might say. If there's a disagreement, then you've got to see this disagreement could have only existed in the 9th century. This is a 9th century argument. This is not a 7th century argument. I hope you're following me. I know not everybody's going to follow this, but this is anybody who speaks Arabic or has learned Arabic can see that this is a glaring historical problem. Now let's move on. So then they said, he then takes and he has Zayd ibn Thabit along with Zubair, Alas, and Harith, Hisham. Those are the 4. So Zayd ibn Thabit, the original secretary, along with 3 friends, they then write the Quran in one original copy. Okay, so now we have one original copy. I hope everybody's following that. Then what Uthman does, coming on down, he takes and he had written many copies. Uthman returned the original copy to Hafsa. He then sent to every Muslim province, that should be underlined as well. Uthman then sent to every Muslim province one copy of what Zayd ibn Thabit, along with Zubair al-As and Harith al-Hisham, the four of them had now written out. Now, Tony, most people don't know how many provinces there were at the time of Uthman. In fact, for many years, I remember having back in when I was studying this at the University of London at the School of Orient and African Studies under Dr. Hawting, this came up in class. And of course, at that time, he said, well, we do know that there were four copies. And so the four copies he's talking about are the copy that went to Zayd ibn Thabit, the one that went to Ubay ibn Ka'b, the one by Ibn Masud, Ibn Musa, which comes out in the traditions much later from what they call the four metropolitan codices. The assumption was, back in the 1990s, when I was studying here at the University of London, there were only four copies, because those are the four copies. That's a wrong assumption. That's not what it's saying here. Read it again. To every province. Now, our colleague was the first one to bring this up. Hatun Tash brought this up about 2 years ago at Speaker's Corner when Mansour Ahmad was confronting us. We were on the ladder. You can see the video up there. He's confronting us on this. And he says, how do you know there were four? How do you know there were four? No one knows there are four. It says every province. And I thank Mansour for asking us, because I always assumed it's just four. Hatun quickly did an analysis. She went back and did a historical study. At the time of Uthman, there were 9 provinces. Let me name them to you: Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Alexandria, Aden, Herat, Nishapur. Those are the 9 provinces that existed under the rule of Uthman. Which means, Tony, it wasn't 4 copies, it was 9 copies that went to 9 cities. Are you seeing why I'm emphasizing this? Mm-hmm. Which means,
and unless people know about Islamic expansion and how far Islam spread through supposedly defensive fighting, they don't line up with this here. So that's why it's important for people to know how far it spread out. I have a map of that in my video on the Muslim Brotherhood, on my video on unveiling the facts of Sharia. You can see the map of how far Islam spread under different caliphs or under different successors to Muhammad himself.
By the time that Uthman comes to power, he controlled all this land, all the way from parts of Iran and parts of Iraq, Nishapur and Herat, and of course, southern parts of Aden, of what is today Yemen, and then of course, Jerusalem, Cairo in Alexandria in Egypt, and Jerusalem, Damascus in Syria, and Basra and Baghdad in Iraq. So all of these 9 provinces were under his control. So now we're looking and we're saying, hold on a minute, that means there should be 9 copies of the Quran. There should be 9 original copies, not 4, 9. We're looking for 9 original copies.
That all say the exact same thing with no errors.
Exact copies, no errors, no changes, nothing that should be any different, and they should all be complete, and they should all be dated from the mid-7th century, from 652. Mm-hmm. So we're upping the ante now, because we're reading their text. This is their material. We didn't make this up, Tony. I didn't write this. You didn't write this. I wouldn't waste my time. All we're doing is looking at what they're saying, and we're coming to conclusions. Now, let's continue on. So 9 copies, 9 different provinces. We need to find one. But it gets worse. And this is what you were intimating, Tony, because then it goes on, and it says that Uthman sent to every province. Then he ordered that all the other Quranic material. So there was other Quranic material. Ooh, this is interesting. Other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies, be burnt. Could you put that up on the screen so people can see that? Be burnt. That's hugely significant. I don't know if we could put that up so people can see that. I don't know. Otherwise, they might think that we're just making this up. Read it right there.
There we go.
Ordered that all the other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies, be burnt. Now, right there, there's a problem here. Tony, why do you burn manuscripts?
You don't if they say the same thing.
Have we ever burned any manuscripts since?
Islam has had this history for a long time of destroying things they don't like. And of course, if you have certain manuscripts that don't match up with other ones, well then, hey, burn them, destroy the evidence. It's like you don't have anything to compare it to. And this is what makes it so different when we compare the Bible that we have today and 24,000 manuscripts in different languages. You know, if you look at a footnotes in your Bible, it lets you know, hey, some manuscripts don't have this. Wouldn't Muslims like to know that basically if there were any disagreements, they were burned, they were destroyed? You don't have anything to even look back and research for yourself.
Tony, we don't burn our manuscripts. There's no reason why we would burn our manuscripts. You say 24,000, that's true. 5,300 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin Vulgates, 9,000 in other languages, roughly 24,000, and still increasing. We have 19,800 in 11 different languages. If we had wanted to corrupt it or change it or delete it or accrete it or do any type of manipulation to the text, we'd have to go to every one of those 24,000 manuscripts. We'd have to go to the 19,800 in all 11 languages, change every one of them so they all agreed, and no one know about it. Now talk about a conspiracy. When Muslims say we have corrupted or changed it, I'd like them to answer this one right here. We do know that in the 300 AD, Diocletian burnt Bible manuscripts, but he was a Roman. The Romans burned our manuscripts, but Christians never burned manuscripts. That's why we have such a treasure trove still lasting today. Remember, I'm asking now Muslims, explain this to me. Why would Uthman burn these manuscripts unless they all disagreed? Unless there was a multiplicity of Qur'ans that did not agree. That's why he had to bring these four men together. That's why they had to take Hafsa's copy. That's why they had to recopy it. That's why they had to, if there were any disagreements, listen, these were not dialogical disagreements. These were not diacritical disagreements. Those didn't even exist in the 7th century. These are wholesale disagreements. These are razm, consonantal text disagreements. And these were existing at this time. Now, I'm just taking this on board. Remember, next week, I'm going to destroy everything I've said today because we're going to go and ask the historical questions. We're not only reading from within the traditions, and already we're finding problem after problem after problem. You do not burn manuscripts unless you want to destroy the evidence. See, I want to know why they destroyed them, and I also want to see where the manuscripts they did burn. I want to look at them to see why they were different. Obviously, there were many Qur'ans at this time. Obviously, there were many competing different recensions. We only know of two so far, one by Abu Bakr and one by Uthman. Now remember, these are caliphs that are giving authority to these two recensions. Between Abu Bakr and between Uthman, you have two completely different copies of which they don't agree. Even the caliphs couldn't control their own Quran. Now that either says incompetence or that this is all being made up as we go along. Regardless of what it is, this is hugely damaging for Islam. This is hugely damaging for anybody that wants to say the Quran is eternal, that it was sent down, that it was compiled completely during the time of Uthman, and that it has never been changed. Now, what we're going to do, and this is what we're going to ask, and this is going to lead us into the next segments that we're going to be doing next week, the week after. I still want to find 9 manuscripts. Listen, this should not be difficult for Muslims to find 9 manuscripts. Outside of Jerusalem, every one of those cities is still under the control of Islam. For 1,400 years, they've controlled those cities. They've controlled those provinces. We don't know of any wholesale damage or wars or fires or floods that would have destroyed these manuscripts. There's no excuse not to have those 4 manuscripts. When you come to London, if you come to London, we can take you down to the British Library, and there in the British Library is the entire New Testament, the Sinaiticus that's from the 4th century. That is 300 years before the time period we're talking about today. The entire New Testament. You can get another copy down in the Vatican in Rome from the 4th century. Right next to the Sinaiticus is the Alexandrinus. The Alexandrinus is both the Old and the New Testament from the 5th century. That is 200 years from the time period we're talking about today. We can now find 365 manuscripts of the New Testament, either complete or partial, from before the 6th century. That's 100 years before the time period we're looking at today. If we could come up with 365 manuscripts from the same area of the world, all of which were preserved during the time of persecution. Remember, for the first 300 years, the church was persecuted. They had to sequester their manuscripts. They had to hide them. They had to remain under the radar. Many of the manuscripts were destroyed in 300 AD. If still we can come up with 365 that predate the Quran by 300 to 200 years, why in the world cannot Muslims come up with 1? That's all we're asking with. We're asking for 1, and they should have 9. Okay? that's a good lead-in to what we're going to do next week. Now, let's just review very quickly. I see we're almost out of time. Can I just quickly review, Tony?
Please go ahead.
Okay, we've got the first problem, and that is, why would God need a further revelation? Secondly, why would he choose someone who's not in the prophetic line, did nothing to prove he was a prophet? His material completely contradicted what had come earlier. God doesn't contradict himself, and didn't even know what God he represented. Why would God choose someone who didn't even know who he was? Sixthly, why would then he choose someone or choose a language that could not even accommodate his revelation, like he had done earlier? He had Hebrew and Greek. Why didn't he just continue using Hebrew and Greek? Why would he use a language that was so new, so crude, so rude, that it could not accommodate something as sophisticated as God's holy word? Seventhly, why did he choose a man who couldn't read or write? Eighthly, why didn't that man, if he couldn't read or write, learn to read or write? He had 23 years to do so. Ninthly, he had a man who was there who could read or write, his secretary. What was the job of that secretary if it wasn't to write down the most important revelation that God had ever given in the history of mankind? So according to what Muslims tell us, he should have written that down. Shame on him for not doing so. And then 10thly, why in the world did Abu Bakr and Umar not get it written down immediately and preserve it, make copies at that time? Why did they make the 9 copies that Uthman then had to do 20 years later? And finally, number 11, when Uthman finally did get the Quran put together, finally wrote it down, had Zayd ibn Thabit, Zubair, Alas, and Harith al-Hisham, the 4 of them, rewrite the Quran, send it out to 9 provinces. Why in the world can't we find those 9? I hope this starts the ball rolling. These are questions that Muslims need to answer. These are disturbing questions. We're just talking about the compilations. We haven't even got through what the traditions say. We don't even have time to go through. That's on the paper that we've given out. All the different, one tradition after another, saying that parts were lost, parts were stolen, others were canceled, some were eaten by sheep. We don't even have time to get into that, Tony. But can you see, these are absolutely disturbing questions. This cannot be a book from God. God would not make this kind of mistakes, and he would not give it to such incompetent people.
Well, I know people are really excited, Dr. Smith, because we're going to ask another 6 weeks of hard questions. And Muslims throughout the world are leaving Islam faster than people want to admit. And it's not only because they're finding out about what the primary sources actually say, and Muslims who are actually looking to the earliest biography of Muhammad and the Hadith and seeing what his life was actually like and comparing that with his claim that he was the perfect man and the perfect Muslim. No. And we have people who are leaving because of that. We have people who are leaving because Jesus, the true Jesus, is visiting Muslims in dreams. So you got Muslims leaving because of that. And then, of course, we have Christians throughout the world who love Muslims because they're people made in the image of God, and they share the gospel with them. And, you know, many Muslims are just the gospel away from leaving Islam. And when a Muslim leaves Islam, well, that's great. I mean, if ISIS put down their guns tomorrow and said, hey, we're going to become moderate now or nominal, that would be great. That'd make this world a better place. But at the end of the day, it'd only make it a better place to go to hell from, because everyone's going to die. Everyone's going to stand before God, and Muslims need the gospel. And Dr. Smith, you've said to yourself, when you ask Muslims over there at Speaker's Corner, hey, what do you think of Christians? What do they say? They say shy, timid, knows little, and can defend little. And unfortunately, the best Christian minds, which used to be Christian, there's just been this polarization between the head and the heart, become more about piety than about being a good thinker and all of that stuff. And we as Christians need to be able to defend the Christian faith, but also to critique other faiths, especially when they are these different lies, and Islam is just one of them. So Dr. Smith, what would you like to say in a closing statement in this first week of the 7-week series?
Well, we're already doing a comparison between these two books, and we've seen pretty clearly which is the bigger, the better book. I keep it bigger for a reason, so you know which is the better, in my opinion, symbolically. When we ask the same question about how the Bible was compiled, goodness sakes, we don't have near the problems that Islam has. We don't burn our manuscripts. We don't compile it and have to recompile it and then change it and then even have an argument as to which dialect you're supposed to write it in. This doesn't even exist in the Bible. And what's fascinating, we retain our manuscripts. Even the ones that disagree, we can see where the disagreements are. And that's the beauty of the Bible. Folks, forget about this book. Come on back to this book. We're going to be saying this quite a bit, but I think you can see why. As something as simple as compiling 2 books, which is a better compilation, we haven't even had a time to tell you how great this book is. That's going to be coming from week to week. God bless you, Tony. Thanks for bringing this up. Thanks to have the platform to be able to ask these disturbing questions. But make sure we don't just ask the questions, that we bring them back home to not only Jesus Christ, but also his revelation, his holy word. This book right
Amen.
here.
Dr. Smith, thank you so much for being on. We look forward to seeing you again next week and again 5 weeks after that. And to our viewers out there, we hope that you come back and join us every single week for this great series as well. As you can tell, a whole lot of information here, information that people throughout the world need, especially Muslims. But most importantly, again, the gospel is the power of God into salvation, not this hard-hitting evidence about Islamic sources, which people do need to know about, but the gospel, that Jesus Christ is Lord, that he is the eternal Son of God incarnate. He lived a perfect, sinless life. He kept the law of Moses. He fulfilled it, and also raised the bar even higher, which no one can keep because we've all sinned against a holy God. Jesus, the Lord, died on the cross. He rose from the dead 3 days later in glory. And we are supposed to go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. That's what we do here on ABN's Trinity channel. We defend the historic Christian faith, and we share the gospel, and we critique Islam, Muhammad, the Qur'an, and other man-made religions out there and worldviews which do not align with reality. So please join us next Monday for another episode of Colliding Worldviews. It'll be week 2 of this great 7-week series, the Historical Critique series with Dr. J. Smith. So thank you so much for being with us. Please share this video with other people. Let them know about the next 6 weeks as we continue on critiquing the primary sources of Islam and the supposed prophet of Islam, Muhammad himself. And just, again, a huge exhortation to reach out to your Muslim neighbors, share the gospel with them, because that is the power of God unto salvation. God bless you, and we'll see you next Monday on Colliding Worldviews.